Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. I know some people will still be trickling in, but we've got a packed agenda and some great panelists. So I'd like to get us started off. We're here today to talk about advancing transformative investments in affordable housing. I'm Jessie Simpson, Government Relations and Policy Manager for the Housing Development Consortium. This is Patience Malaba, Executive Director of HDC. We have Tony Yuchasz, who we brought on as a contract lobbyist to push for REIT, a real estate excise tax. We have Rachael Myers from the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance, David Tan from Mount Baker Housing, Ben Stuckart from the Spokane Low Income Housing Consortium, and of course, Representative Frank Chopp. I'm going to start us off by asking Patience to ground us in the need for funding for affordable housing. What's the scale of resources compared to the need?
All right. Sorry, folks, that's how much we need homes in Washington State. Just to introduce myself, I am Patience Malaba, Executive Director at the Housing Development Consortium of Seattle King County. We are a membership association that's working across the region to really rethink how we house people and advance effective solutions. One thing that we sit in reality of is the fact that we are facing a shortfall of homes. We are $250 million across Washington State short on homes to meet the need for people. And that need is further exacerbated when you really look at who is most impacted. And when you zero in on those numbers in specific regions. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about King County because that's where we spend a lot of our time. But as we learned earlier, the housing issue is a statewide issue. There is no urban-rural uniqueness. There is a lot of uniqueness in place, but the crisis is impacting people across the state. And the solutions are really needed across the state. So in King County right now, the Department of Commerce is projecting that we need 212,000 homes for people who are making below 80% area median income. And that's in order to make sure that they're not paying more than a third of their income towards housing. That number has to be met by 2044. And in order to get there, we need to produce 8,800 homes annually to meet that need. And currently, we're not close to that number in terms of production. We're in fact up against an economic trend where construction costs have skyrocketed, up against the great work of state representatives like Representative Chopp, who've won a number, more than a dozen, so many revenue tools at the state level. The LP Health Home that he will talk about, the work just recently at the state level with investments that were well over $600 million in affordable housing investment. But while we have that great work that has happened, we continue to face a shortfall. Just to bring it even closer home, right now, the capital cost per unit on an average is about $300,000. And in order for us to produce that 8,800 number annually, we're going to need well over $1 billion in funds, $1.9 billion in King County alone. Currently, within our coffers, we have $984 million. So if you combine the $984 million with the 1.9 that we need, in total, our need is $2.9 billion. This is just King County. And I pause there to just let this sit for you because we're lucky to have elected officials who are championing for tools. Public-private partners who are coming into the sector to contribute and support the work. And even with all that great work, we continue to have a gap. So more needs to be done. We need to be bolder in our actions over the coming years in order for us to be effective. One of the ways that we can do that is through the state legislative session. And you will hear today about concepts that we've been working on. One of the other ways we can do that is to continue to invite the public-private philanthropic partners to come in and continue to support and scale solutions. And a part of our discussion today is to also help you understand the responsibility we have in advocating for all of these ideas that are being talked about to see themselves across the finish line. Because in many cases, as much as Rachael works at the state level to get us the wins that they do as a Housing Alliance, it takes a lot of advocacy to get there. Legislators need to hear from all of you as housing providers, from your experience, from your interaction with residents in your own housing projects, to talk about the need from a real human perspective, so we can get those wins across the finish line. Now, without further ado, I will pause here and hand back over to Jessie to invite Tony, who can speak about the REIT bill that we have been working on.
Yes, thank you for that patience. Turning over to Tony, I'll let you introduce yourself for a moment.
Yeah, super. Well, good afternoon. My name is Tony Yuchasz. I'm a community organizer and a part-time lobbyist in Olympia. I've spent the last 5 years or so working in the affordable housing policy space, working on the Apple Health and Homes Act, efforts to reduce the cost of public lands for affordable housing and to help raise revenue. And prior to that, I spent 17 years in electoral politics and policy.
Thanks. So to start off, what is a real estate excise tax, or REIT?
Yeah, sure. So the real estate excise tax, or more commonly called REIT, is a tax that the state of Washington levies on the sale of properties. Local governments also have the option to levy a REIT tax, and most of them across the state do.
How much money does the REIT raise statewide currently?
Yeah, so the estimate right now for fiscal year 22 is about 2.4 billion. Most of that goes into the general fund. It does fund some other things like the Education Legacy Trust Fund and the Public Works Assistance Account, but largely it goes in to support the general fund.
That was 2.4 billion, you said?
Correct.
A lot of money. What's happened at the state level recently to change that number?
Yeah, so in 2019, the state overhauled the way that it taxes the sale of properties. Prior to that, you just paid a flat fee on the the sale of a home. In 2019, they moved to a graduated system where you pay a lower rate if your home sells for a lower amount, and they scale that rate up all the way to a 3% tax on the sale of homes that are selling over $3 million.
And then on the local side, what are the current REITs that local jurisdictions, cities and counties can levy?
Yeah, so cities and counties can level what is typically called REIT 1 and REIT 2. Both of those are 0.25%, and they are spent on specific things, capital projects, which are largely defined as roads and streets and things of this nature, sewer systems, et cetera.
And how much does that raise in King County on a annual basis?
I will have to look at the King County number. I can tell you that across the state, local the estimate for fiscal year 22 is about 700 million statewide. So, yeah.
The two of us have been working closely to develop a proposal to fund affordable housing using an expanded REIT level, expanded REIT revenue. Could you talk about these policy proposals under consideration?
Yeah, so we've been working with a coalition of folks to try to raise some additional revenue dedicated to affordable housing. And the concept to do that is to add an additional tier to that graduated state level REIT, which I just talked about, and to tax properties that are selling over $5 million at a level of 4%. That would raise, an estimated 220 million per year, or 440 million for the biennium. And we would advocate that that be dedicated as a permanent funding source for the Housing Trust Fund.
Great.
In addition to that, I'll just keep going if that's okay. At the local level, we are interested in trying to provide local governments with what would be called REIT 3, that third sort of 1/4%, dedicated to affordable housing, with some parameters around that. And all this is still to be determined, but generally 60% AMI and below for rental housing, 80% AMI and below for home ownership. And again, it would be dedicated to affordable housing. Local governments would have the option to implement that by councilmanic vote. Any city or town that's implemented REIT 1 and REIT 2, would have access to REIT 3.
Right. To stick on the scale point, you mentioned how much the expanded REIT at the state level could raise, 220 million a year. How much are we talking in terms of local jurisdictions?
Yeah.
Like how much could be raised across King County?
Right. So again, the numbers by county are not available here yet, but again, statewide, we're talking about another $300 million in local REIT revenue that could be available if every city and town that has implemented REIT 1 and 2 were to in fact implement REIT 3.
And just broadly, why is it important that local jurisdictions have access to that local funding?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. One, I think we all recognize that by and large, affordable housing does not get built without public subsidy. And so simply giving local governments an additional tool to put more money into the system is useful in and of itself. But the other important point is that it will make local proposals more competitive for additional resources, the State Housing Trust Fund and Finance Commission tax credits. So it's just critical that we give local governments the option to do this.
Well, all this sounds great, but what are the barriers to it? Who's going to show up in Olympia against you?
Right, sure. So to that, I would say, anytime you try to raise revenue, there are going to be some detractors, right? I'm sure there are plenty of folks in this room who, love taxes for affordable housing, but in the general public, you're going to find a little more opposition to that. In addition, there are folks in the legislature, decision makers, policymakers who may not like the idea of a dedicated account, dedicating tax revenue that typically would go to the general fund into the Housing Trust Fund. But to that, I guess I would say it's not unprecedented. We do that a little bit already by creating sort of a top tier tax on those really high end properties. We're creating a nexus between the taxing source and the problem that we're trying to solve. And as we'll hear a little later from Representative Chopp, housing and its intersection with behavioral health is the issue of our time. And if we can't figure out how to do something bold now, when will we? And what's the better idea?
Thanks, Tony.
Yep.
How can people get involved?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I'm just going to close out by saying once again, I'm a community organizer, and for the moment I have a microphone, so I'm going to ask you to do something. I brought with me a piece of paper, my business cards. I'm asking you to get involved in the next legislative session. you will not believe the impact that you all can have if you take a few minutes to contact your personal legislators. I'm going to be running an effort this next year to ask folks to contact their state representatives and their senators multiple times throughout the course of session. And it has an impact if they are hearing from the people who live in their district. So please take 2 minutes, get your name on my list, take my card, message me in the app, give me an email that I can use to talk to you about advocacy, and please get involved.
Thanks for that. We're going to swap over now to Rachael, who can tell us more about the Housing Trust Fund broadly, beyond this proposal to create a dedicated funding source. How is the Housing Trust Fund currently funded? What is it? And what's the source of the funds?
Sure. Can I introduce my organization first?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Rachael
absolutely.
Myers with the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance. We're a statewide policy advocacy organization, membership-based organization. Individuals and organizations across the state are our members. And we work on addressing the affordable housing and homelessness crisis in Washington state, focused primarily at the state legislative level. Can I just real quick see a show of hands? How many of you are members? Oh, that should be more, but thank you. If you need to know how to become a member, it's WLIHA.org.
Thanks. Yeah, Wilha is a great partner. So onto the Housing Trust Fund. I understand that Wilha is the main advocacy organization for the Housing Trust Fund on an annual basis. What is the Housing Trust Fund, and who funds it? How do you get involved in that?
Yeah. So the State Housing Trust Fund has been in existence since, I'm going to look to some other people like Representative Chopp, like 1988, right? Ish. And has grown steadily, has grown over that time. It's this primary way that the state of Washington invests money in building and acquiring affordable homes. It is funded through the capital budget. It's financed with bonds. It primarily, what else did you ask me in that question?
Yeah, how do lawmakers fund it on an annual basis? How do
So
they
yeah,
decide?
so one of the most important things to know about the Housing Trust Fund is that it essentially starts from zero every year. Unlike things that are funded in the operating budget, where there's kind of like a baseline, and if the dollar amount goes down the next year, then we talk about that was a cut. The legislature is trying to cut this thing, but the Housing Trust Fund essentially starts from nothing every year. So how much funding is available, because there's no permanent funding source, and there's no just sort of steady where we don't know we're always going to get 100 million or 200 million or even 20 million. So every year it's the same sort of sustained advocacy effort that's required, that never really changes. And every year, how much we advocate and what other economic pressures, what other budget pressures exist, and how like loud our voices are as affordable housing advocates is going to determine how much money is available for the Housing Trust Fund.
And in the recent past, how much money has been available for the Housing Trust Fund?
Well, in the last biennium, the Housing Trust Fund had its biggest allocation ever. And there are some folks here who know like all the details of the Housing Trust Fund better than I do. Karina is here from Commerce. Is Nate here by chance? There might be some other Commerce people here. So if I get anything wrong, will you just like ask her in the pink shirt? Or just tell me if I get something wrong. So the last biennium, the total amount was, in the first half of the biennium, it was 175. And in the short session in 2022, the legislature invested about another $113 million. So 288 million-ish, does that seem about right? That was the high watermark. That's more money that we've ever had in the trust fund. Really, really important. And what we need is probably about 5 times that much every biennium. So really, really important. A lot of homes housing a lot of people, but not enough to solve the crisis.
So on the topic of people and who the Housing Trust Fund serves, who is primarily served by the Housing Trust Fund? Are we talking about housing for people exiting homelessness, low-income seniors, low-wage workers?
All of the above. The Housing Trust Fund can serve people earning up to 80% of the area median income. The large majority of folks who live in trust fund funded homes earn at or below about 30% of the area median income. And that is a good thing, a really good thing, because we know that that's where the biggest gap is. That is where the biggest need is in every community across the state, is for housing that's affordable to people at the very lowest income levels. And yeah, it funds housing for people experiencing homelessness or exiting homelessness, farm workers, seniors, veterans, people with disabilities. The Housing Trust Fund really, low wage working families. The Housing Trust Fund really serves that whole continuum.
Does the Housing Trust Fund focus solely on rental housing, or is there also an affordable homeownership component?
The Housing Trust Fund does both rental housing and affordable homeownership. And it doesn't do enough of either. We need more funds in both of those categories, but it does provide funding for affordable homeownership and rental.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that we need probably about 5 times as much as we're actually getting through the Housing Trust Fund in the billion scale. But in terms of how much we're actually trying to advocate for in the practical budget next year, what's WILHA targeting?
Well, I've said to a few people, and I always say this at this time of year, as much as we can get is the answer for how much we're going to be asking for. And I know that's not a very good answer. Everybody wants a number. But this is the time of year when we're kind of waiting for, more budget projections and talking to lawmakers and trying to see like what's a stretch number and what is going to get us laughed out of the, we need to come up with a number that we can potentially achieve, but that's actually going to make a difference. So I'll tell you where we're kind of starting and are thinking right now. And I want to give massive props to our colleagues at the Department of Commerce who have made a recommendation that is now in the hands of the governor's office. And the next step in the budget process is going to be the governor's proposed budget. They're recommending $400 million for the Housing Trust Fund. 200 million of that, yeah, right? Yes. That's incredible. 200 million of that would be for new construction, generally what you probably think of as traditional Housing Trust Fund. 100 million, you're going to hear more about this from Rep. Chopp, for Apple Health and Homes and permanent supportive housing, 50 million for home ownership, and 50 million for preservation. And in each of those categories, a chunk set aside for to go directly to organizations that are considered by and for organizations that are usually culturally specific organizations, the organizations that have relationships in Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. And if those organizations have funds, we're going to make it's going to be one very important way of making sure that trust fund resources are actually reaching folks in BIPOC communities. And so I think that the biggest priority, the biggest recommendation from Commerce for the most dedicated to buy and for is in the homeownership realm. And that's been a major focus. We know that a big part of the racial wealth gap is because of who has been able to purchase a home and who has not been able to purchase a home. So really exciting recommendations from the Department of Commerce. So thank you.
Thanks for that. You maybe touched on it already, but beyond the amount of funding, is there anything else we should know about Housing Trust Fund policies and advocacy for next year?
Yeah, I don't think I have much to say about policy. I will just reinforce the advocacy. Like I said, it starts from zero every year, and how effectively we advocate and how loud we are, and how many times legislators hear about the housing crisis and about solutions to the housing crisis, including the Housing Trust Fund, makes all the difference in what the final budget number is. We know that lawmakers right now who are running for the election, they're running to keep their seats this year, are hearing at the doors the cost of housing is just extraordinarily high. Rents are going up, homelessness is growing. So people are hearing this at the doors. They need to keep hearing it throughout the rest of the year and then throughout the session.
Thanks. Moving over to David, you want to start us off by telling us about Mount Baker Housing?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Tan. I'm the Executive Director of Mount Baker Housing Association. Mount Baker Housing is a smallish nonprofit that is doing affordable housing, developing and operating in South Seattle. Mount Baker Housing was formed about 1987, I believe. The city asked the local community to form a nonprofit to help preserve an affordable community called Mount Baker Village. And Mount Baker Village is, I use the phrase culturally important to the city of Seattle because it is and still remains the home of a large population of Southeast Asian refugees from the 70s. And the property was in interesting shape and it needed some rehabilitation. And the idea there was to, rehab the facility or the property and make sure that these folks could continue to remain there. Over time and through leadership change, Mount Baker Housing has evolved into more of a developer than it used to be. We used to be just an operator. And now we have a very robust pipeline of new development that we are embarking on. We are about to finish 200 units in South Seattle on the corner of McClellan and MLK. And we just broke ground on another 210 units a little bit further north there. Couple of interesting things which actually relate to a question that you might have asked before, but we typically finance our new development projects with the stack that everybody thinks of, the tax credit stack. I mean, we would, for example, use the Housing Trust Fund as a portion of that stack to fill, be one of the bricks in the building, if you will. And it's as everyone knows, it's a challenging stack to build, and every opportunity that we get to find sort of new investment, new ways of thinking about things would be welcome. So I'm just kind of saying, everybody who's asking you to advocate, I'm kind of asking you to do the same. So Mount Baker is primarily focused on housing for folks who are at 60% of AMI. We do dab a little bit into the 80% category, but mostly 60% and below.
So to go into a little more detail on that traditional financing or capital stack, how is affordable housing developments, how are affordable housing developments that you create financed in a traditional sense?
Well, in our traditional sense, I don't know, there's some more experienced developers in here than I am. Patrick, there's some other folks. But typically the way we have done this is maybe a little backwards, because we acquire property up front through, the help of folks like, hi, Bob, the land acquisition program with the commission. We have been a buy and hold until developer. And then when it's time, we finance our pre-development mostly by borrowing. So in our case, I don't know if Joel's in here somewhere, but Impact Capital, for example, has been a huge partner with us in providing pre-development financing for our projects. And everyone knows that's a couple of $1 million bucks. So to get a 200 unit project from twinkle in the eye to fully permitted is expensive, and we borrow to do it, which is risky. But where we go from there is then to the traditional low-income housing tax credit stack for the most part. We apply to the Seattle Office of Housing for funding. We apply to the Housing Trust Fund, King County. We make an application for 4% bonds because we are a 4% bond user and tax credits associated with that. And then I know you're going to ask this later, but there's also been, in our case, a new player in our stack. But until the new player, that was the traditional stack.
Sure, we can probably just say who the new player, like Amazon.
Yeah, so for us, Mount Baker Housing is I think I am accurate in saying this, Mount Baker Housing was the first new construction lending that the Amazon Housing Trust Fund, Amazon Housing Equity Fund has done. And as you know, the HEF is a $2 billion fund which Amazon put together for 3 of their HQs, if you will, Nashville, Northern Virginia, and Seattle. So in Seattle, I think we're the first new construction loan that they've made.
So how would you compare this Amazon Housing Equity Fund process to the more traditional bank lending and tax credit?
I was on a panel last Friday describing this to the Gwinnett County Chamber of Commerce, who was in Seattle, and Amazon graciously hosted them for an economic development forum. And the way I described the Amazon Housing Equity Fund process is it's backwards. And what I mean by that is typically, when you apply for funding, you apply and you go through a whole series of application questions and underwriting and all of that stuff, and then an award is made, hopefully. In the Amazon Housing Equity Fund process, you apply essentially with the policy reason you're applying. The Housing Equity Fund Policy Committee meets and goes through an approval process solely based on policy, not really based on typical underwriting. So, what's our liquidity number? Amazon had no idea. How much per unit was this going to be in terms of the entire stack? They kind of had a general idea. The real backwardism, if you will, is they approved the idea first and then began to work on creating the product that went with it.
Interesting. What have you found to be Amazon's priorities with funding affordable housing?
Well, there's, I think, a couple that are important to Amazon. One is, support of the HQ communities that they work in, that they largely employ in. Also, it's very important. We have found, because we are an organization led by a person of color, that is extremely important to the Housing Equity Fund policy folks. And then probably most importantly, I would say, we were able to, and other folks or other organizations that I know that have been successful with the fund have been they've been very clear that, as we have, who in essence our target audience is, who are our residents, why is this important for them, why are we, what is it that we are getting from them that the Housing Equity Fund dollars in that finance stack will help create for the community. So it's interestingly listener focused, if you will. Right? They're listening as opposed to dictating.
Stepping back a little bit, what do you see as the role of corporate or private philanthropy in funding affordable housing more generally?
That's the existential question, isn't it? From my perspective, it's in our house when I was growing up. My father was an immigrant, Chinese immigrant, and I don't know where he learned all this stuff, but man, he was the font of maxims, phrases, whatever you call them. And one of his favorite ones, which had absolutely nothing to do with what he meant it had to do with, was charity starts at home. And from my perspective, corporate responsibility really means that where you work, where you employ, where you create your product, whatever it is, you have an obligation, I think, to leave the community or to assist the community in being better, or in being more, being safer, having more opportunity than it did when you showed up. And from my perspective, and it's maybe, I don't know how to put it, but it's my personal one. You actually do better when you do better for the community that you work in. And so, in a region like the Puget Sound region, which has, as we've heard, a significant housing shortage, a significant housing problem, it only benefits organizations, for-profits, nonprofits, government to do what they can to contribute to helping to solve the problem. I don't think there's an implied question in your question, which is how should they do it? Should it just be money? Should it just be grants? Should it just be loans? I don't know. I don't know what form that should take, but I do know that there's, I feel like there's benefit on both sides of the equity equation, both corporate equity and human equity, to participating in the process, and we'd all be just a whole lot better off for it.
Thanks, David. Moving over to Ben, I'll let you introduce yourself and your organization.
So my name is Ben Stuckart. I'm head of the Spokane Low Income Housing Consortium. So I hope you've been enjoying Spokane and the beautiful river outside. We're a membership-based organization. We have 30 members that range from individuals to architects to for-profit developers, mainly our nonprofit developers developing low-income housing.
Thanks. So beyond funding, which we've been talking a lot about today, one of the key barriers to developing affordable housing is cheap and discounted land. I understood that you've stood up a land banking program here in Spokane. Can you tell me what the contours of that program are?
Yeah, so I've been head of the Low Income Housing Consortium for 3 years. So I listen a lot. I'm by no means an expert, but our local organizations like Community Frameworks and Habitat for Humanity came to me and said, one of the barriers is you don't have that much funding up front. Buy and hold doesn't really work for smaller organizations. And so they kept saying land bank. And then our community action agency, SNAP, did a report last year that said 15 states have created land banks. So they sell it to the nonprofit or give it to the nonprofit instead of holding it like a community land trust. And then they made great recommendations on legislative changes and sustainable funding. But instead of waiting for that, we decided just to go. And I was talking to a couple CEOs of credit unions and telling them about what a great idea a land bank would be, because they really want to be involved. But in their minds, sometimes it's just, we'll give you loans. And we know that there's subsidy that's needed and land can be a barrier. So I was telling them about the land bank and they said, well, we'll fund the startup. We'll help you pay for all the lawyers and the legal formation. And then later when I'd done that, I went back to them and said, well, I need now due diligence on some land. And they put more money in the land bank. And so they at least helped start it. But the goal, and we've had 2 nonprofits now that have said, we're not into buying land speculatively. We can't afford to. But if you come to us with land, we will start developing again. And each of them have done 1 project in Spokane. And then because the credit unions let it, like if I would have sent a press release out that said, we created a land bank, it would have been nowhere and there would have been silence in the room. But because the CEOs of the credit unions sent the press releases out, it ended up on the cover of the paper, head of the Business Journal. It was on 2 of the TV stations, and then our weekly put a big 2-page spread on it. And then I started getting calls from people that I knew and that were interested in low-income housing. And we've now got 3 pieces of land that have been donated. And one of them's big enough for a project of well over 50 units. 2 of them are actually. And then a couple are just some infill lots. But to me, it's like if you wait for things to happen, they don't happen. And if you just kind of go forward, you can at least start moving forward. And then, yeah, so that's and then I took Representative Chopp on a tour yesterday of some housing sites in Spokane. And so I had a captive audience in my car.
Yeah, nice little strategy there.
I drove a bit too fast.
Can't just at the conference be like, oh, I see someone there. Yeah.
Yes.
You kind of brushed through a lot of my questions, honestly, but I think one of the big things I'm wondering is how much subsidy is needed in Spokane beyond like free land to make affordable housing developments pencil?
In 2017, when I really started digging into low-income housing, that number was about 50,000 per unit that we needed to meet. And that's why it was really the city of Spokane and the community lobbied really hard. And thank you, Representative Chopp, for passing House Bill 1590 that allows local dollars to come in. But then sometimes, like in Spokane, our county doesn't believe in increasing taxes. And so you only get the city with $1590. So it's a missed opportunity. But that number with construction costs increase have gone well above 75,000 per unit with increase from 50,000 a few years ago. And so that's a significant, so if we can, like I saw this other that you showed me, Jessie, right beforehand.
Yep.
What's this one's called? The
housing benefit district.
Yeah, the housing benefit
it's a
district.
simultaneous.
The more we
session.
can put dedicated funds into things like the housing trust fund, keep moving forward with Apple Health, and then I really think that localities have to have the opportunity, and then we need to all elect the right people that are going to vote for housing. Though it affects every single aspect of our life.
Yeah. How do you think about land banking as part of a suite of policy tools? Like,
and I think the
deployed by
legislature or local government or the feds, if they're going to have to make some changes. So we have still over from 2008 housing crisis collapse in the mortgage market. We at the high point had over 1,000 zombie homes that have liens on them and are held by the banks. And there's 300 now. So there's progress being made, but there's over 300 in Spokane. And the 15 other cities that have land banks have used land banks as a really good tool to pass legislation to erase those liens. Then the land bank takes them over and puts them into low income housing. So if we think about 2,000 homeless people in Spokane, and you think about 300 homes that we could get on the market in low income status, you could house a lot of people real quick. And it's the same as like the rapid acquisition fund for hotels. Did that answer it?
Yeah,
I got lost.
part of it. Yeah. Beyond just the zombie homes, how do you think we could scale up land banking here in Spokane and statewide?
Well, I think the legislator did a great job in 2018. They passed a law that said that city, municipalities, counties, and state agencies can transfer land to an entity if it's for low-income housing. But there needs to be a real look statewide at state agencies own a lot of land that hasn't been in use for the last 20 years, 30 years. Cities have lots of land that has not been used. I have a big map on my wall of all the city, county, and land, and we go driving every week and looking at that because the elected leaders have the ability to get that land put into low-income housing. So I think that's a huge push that we have to do, is surplus land. And then there needs to be a dedicated funding source for both the housing trust funds, community land trusts that exist for the purpose of housing, and also land banks.
Thanks, Ben. We're going to move now to Representative Frank Chopp, one of my representatives. I don't think he needs too much of an introduction, but I'll
Frank,
let him say a few words if you'd like.
No, I'm Frank. Go ahead.
All right, I'd like to start off by giving you the opportunity to talk about a significant win from the last session. A few others have mentioned it, the Apple Health and Homes Act. What is it? What's the vision, and how's it funded?
Well, to start, I want to thank the Department of Commerce and Healthcare Authority for implementing Apple Health and Home. And Melody, do you want to stand up there? This is Melody Pizzolt, who's the new head of the Office of Apple Health and Homes. She's actually having the next hour a focused effort session on Apple Health and Homes. But basically, it's based on a simple reality. After a little bit of research, though many more people have done a lot more research than me, it was obvious that about 70% of our neighbors who are chronically homeless are homeless because of their medical condition, mental illness, substance use disorder, or significant physical disability. And so, what we're dealing with is essentially that reality. And so the premise is very simple. If you're homeless because of your medical condition, then you will have a home as part of your medical treatment. And the reason this is so important, say you're on Medicaid. By the way, this is for folks who are low income. Obviously, if they're homeless, they'll probably all qualify for Medicaid. But say you're on Medicaid and you have a stroke and you get taken to the emergency room. They probably wheel you into all sorts of tests. They probably put you into MRI machine. Nobody's sitting around trying to fundraise for the MRI machine while that's going on. But that's expected of us for housing for those same individuals. The other thing is that, sorry, if you don't mind, I know you got other questions, but anyway, it saves a ton of money. There's studies all across the country that are showing that if you do a simple thing of providing a place as a home for people that stabilizes them and then gets them connected with services, you save on average like over $40,000 per person per year. So we have to convert that ethic into actual services and housing for folks. And that's it. That's the basic premise. But I just am very excited by that we got it done in one session. And part of that is based on all the work that people have done for a number of years through the Healthcare Authority with foundational community supports. The actual bill is House Bill 1866. You could read it to see the medical conditions. So we're saying if you meet those medical conditions, you should have a home. Now we have to produce the housing.
So looking ahead to the next session, I know you're closely involved in drafting a policy called the Covenant Reinvestment Account. Can you describe the background and vision for this policy?
Well, the basic thing is I invite you to go online at the University of Washington or Eastern Washington University. Those two institutions are researching what were called restrictive real estate covenants. That sounds pretty warm and fuzzy, covenant. But in fact, if you read the language, it is absolutely horrible. The language used, I don't even want to say it here, just read it yourself. And you will be compelled to say that we need to do something about this. These covenants were in existence from the 20s to I think it was 1968. And generations have suffered from that discrimination, just abject. And the key about it is the state of Washington is complicit because we recorded all those documents for decades. So we're proposing that we use that nexus, that legal nexus, to assess something on a document recording fee into the future. And in order to provide a significant amount of money for down payment assistance, also assistance to BIPOC organizations to recruit and provide technical assistance and training so people can afford to buy a home. And with that money, we would subsidize the down payments significantly. Now, we need to work together not only do that, but also provide a supply of housing that actually is affordable for people to buy. And there's lots of models that are very promising along those lines. So I probably answered several of your questions you're going to ask me, but
yeah, a little bit. We could go down the rabbit hole of what are those models you find interesting.
Okay, here's an example if you want. In the rapid acquisition, there's been about 7 buildings, brand new buildings bought. They're empty because they're brand new. And they're nice because they were intended for the open market. So they brand new. Those average like 250,000 to 300,000 per unit. So one obvious thing is just buy the building that's new, so you don't have to displace anybody, and then make them into condominiums for people at a price for the unit with a huge down payment assistance. By the way, we're not talking about a couple $1,000 here. We're talking about significant down payment assistance so people can get over the hump to afford the mortgage payments. And we're thinking of making it eligible for folks, you know, say making up to 100% of AMI. But these would be reserved for BIPOC individuals and families because they're the ones who are horribly discriminated against. There's no question about that. Just read the language.
Yeah,
we have
on that point of eligibility and racial disparity. How are you thinking through the, I don't know, the conflicts between the point of the policy, which is to address racial inequities in home ownership, and then the fair housing law, which makes it illegal to explicitly discriminate or like make these official race-based policies?
Well, we live in a society that recognizes that when the wrong is done, we could do something to fix the wrong. A wrong was done, folks. Hundreds of thousands of people have been discriminated against. That means we have a responsibility to fix that, to provide a remedy. And that way, because it was based on a state action recording all those documents that were in writing, then we could say that the state has a responsibility to make up for it, to provide a remedy for it. So it doesn't get caught up in a general statement, because you know the state law says and federal law says you can't play preference or say, unless people were harmed and you can show it directly. Well, there it is. It's in writing. It's all over the place. And so that then frees up the program to go forward and target the people who were actually harmed.
Mm-hmm.
And but in terms of eligibility, obviously we want to focus on BIPOC folks because they were the ones discriminated against. But we also want to make sure that people can afford the down payment, or excuse me, afford the monthly mortgage payments. But in terms of who becomes eligible at first, we need to think that through. So we're taking, we invite you to help us refine this legislation. Because should we focus first, for example, on people who whose families used to live in the state of Washington between the 1920s and the 1970s, or just to start, say, or do we just open it up? So we're working through that, and I want to thank Patience in particular and others who are working on this thing. And it looks like Patience is going to cut me off here, so I just want to thank her again. Okay.
No, just to add, and thank you for your great work on the bill. On top of the nexus, I mean, most recently, the Department of Commerce released the Washington State Home Ownership Disparities Workgroup Report. And thanks to Karina and Ann and the team at Commerce, who just did exceptional work in putting the report together. But one thing that it emphasizes is this gap between white home ownership and Black home ownership or BIPOC home ownership. We have a persistent 19%. You have 68% home ownership for white households. You have an average of 49% for BIPOC. When you look deeper into that number, it goes even further down when you get to Black households. So those are the numbers that are really compelling in terms of the need for us to recognize the nexus, but also recognize how this has been embedded in the system and continues to yield the same inequities that we're really trying to address. So really appreciate the work that's being done.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up, because having these reports are extremely effective to quantify what the problem is, like you just said. So thanks for the folks who have been involved in that. At the same time, we need everybody's help to refine the legislation to make sure it works. Mm-hmm. And we got to fulfill that thing, because how many times have you heard words about racial justice? I mean, it's all over the time. People talk. Okay, we got to turn that rhetoric about racial justice into reality. And you got to be part of that to help solve this across the board. No, thank you.
Yeah, you got the applause line. So returning to the Covenant Reinvestment Act fee itself, how much are we talking in terms of funding? How much could it bring in on an annual basis?
Well, actually, I worked closely with Rachael and others to create the Home Security Fund in years past. That eventually got up to, I think, about $150 per document, dedicated to helping homeless folks with services. So that is the first priority. We have to make sure that that amount is made whole or kept whole. That's the first priority, because we got to help the homeless, obviously, for obvious reasons. At the same time, having another $100 on a real estate document that is talking about $1 million home, will anybody even notice? And so we want to add $100 per document to be recorded, real estate documents, not all documents, but real estate documents. And that adds up on average over the years of about $150 million per year. So I'm saying over a generation, which people say is 20 years, that's $3 billion. So we could talk about all the statistics and all the words and all that, but it comes down to having some money that can make a difference. And that's what we're about. But we got to do it in order. We got to protect what we already have with the Home Security Fund, and then also go beyond that in a way that makes sense to people. And we'll be developing some information to back up the numbers. And I think we have to decide, which covenant we actually quote. Because if you see the language, oh my God, I think if 90% of the public, they saw, they said, my God, this has been horrible. We got to do something about it. So let's do something about it.
Yeah. And just to end, what are the barriers you see to the covenant reinvestment accounts passage this year?
Well, I've been very, very heartened by how excited people are about this. I got people competing to be prime sponsors of the bill. Because if you know me, I get things done, but I don't sponsor myself. I have other people do it because then you get more people and more credit and everybody loves that. Okay, so the thing is that with that, I think we have a shot to do this next year because the industries that have been related directly to the covenants know they have a problem. First of all, they do have a heart and they realize what was done was horrible, but they're beginning to realize they got to do something about it. So I believe the realtors and banks and things like that will actually have an incentive to work with us to implement this because, we just have to read the covenants back to them and say, how can this be? And you don't do anything about it. Now, luckily, there are some companies, banks, et cetera, that are providing some initial funding, but it is really modest. With the document recording fee, which raises $3 billion over 20 years. And I'm going to make a challenge to the private industries that benefited from those racist documents. They have a responsibility to come up with some matching funds to do even more. So we invite a partnership there, not by forcing by state legislation, but to appeal to their better natures. That this is, they should do something about it.
Thanks. Final plug. If someone's interested in getting involved in this, what should they do? Who should they contact?
Well, I'll be here. You can come up and talk to me. But we have a lot of people involved in this. Like I said, we got a core work group. So if you want to participate that, we could use your help in terms of defining the details and making it workable, particularly on the supply end of it, because I think we have a clear case to assess this and have a legal nexus and an argument. But if they don't have homes that are affordable, it makes it illusory. So we need to define that additional housing supply in a way that all of you have been working on for years, so that I'm confident that we'll be able to make some real progress here. So I'm hopeful that people would be willing to vote it in next session, but we need your help. By the way, can you lock the doors? And we have this sign up sheet here, so we need you to call people and to help us out. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. And I'll build on that and say it's going to take the coalition of the willing to really get this bill across the finish line. Some of the biggest hurdles are the legality of how much do we co-race within the bill. And that often comes up. It's very much bound within being able to be compliant and pushing those bounds. It doesn't take just one legislator. It takes all of us really coming together to get the bill across the finish line. And that's why we're inviting financial institutions to also be a part of that work and scale up what would be coming out of the bill overall. And we look forward to working with all of you as we prepare for 2023 legislative session.
One other thing, I do have some copies of the one-page outline for this. So if you want to see it, just come up, I'll pass them out.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to everyone who attended. Great session.